Thank you, Piero, for the kind introduction. And I guess I've been continuing my research with Roger to some extent, but now I'm really centered at in San Jose, at San Jose State University. I've been doing some research also at Berkeley. And so I guess just to give a little bit of background for you all on how I got to where I am. My name is Andrew Blanton, as we just went over, right? And I'm currently the area coordinator for the Center of Art and Design Research and Education, CADRE, at San Jose State University. I'm also working as a researcher at the Center for New Music and Audio Technology at the University of California, Berkeley. I started my studies in classical percussion at the University of Denver and went on to study new media art at the University of North Texas in the IARTA cluster with David Stout. I then went on to work in Dr. Roger Molina's Art Science Lab as the first researcher there in that lab. By the end of my master's studies, much of my research was focused around the idea that computers were being built to emulate our own human experience of the world and our corporeal existence. This idea has formed the underlying driving force in much of my research, and I have released 4 applications in the Apple App Store and frequently perform works around the world. So I just wanted to give that sort of like introduction as to like who I am and what I do. And I guess I would also like to dive into this other side of things. I was just recently in Dublin, where I got to see Brian Eno's 77 million paintings. And it was a spectacular work. And think about like how he talks about procedural art. And he mentioned this quote at the beginning that I found quite lovely, and I really resonated with it. And I guess, I can just read this thing real fast. He says, I spent 5 years at art school torn between visual art and music, wanting to do both, but feeling I had to make a choice between them. As time went on, I began working with light and sound together, gradually realized that they could overlap, that you can make visual objects that behave like music, i.e. they change in time like music does, and music that behaves like paintings, i.e. music that sits still, becomes an atmosphere. There's a new place between the two, and it's that place that I've been exploring in my installation work. And I guess, just to really frame out my research and the type of work that I really enjoy doing, I think there is this space of how we understand computers and technology in a way that is more in depth and more engaged than simply chasing the newest technology and what computers can possibly do. How do we look at computers and use them as a device of reflection on humanity and where we're going as a culture, where we're going as a species, and the things that are the both negative and positive outputs of this. So it's wonderful to see some of the other works that we're giving here tonight, talking about this sort of art-science confluence and how these things work together. I do think technology in general, artists have worked with technology for a long time. And we're sort of in this constant evolution. We're sort of at the precipice of where human society is, both in terms of modernization and modernity. So I guess in thinking about my work, tonight I'm going to talk about really 3 primary categories. And talk about, again, as technology is evolving, how do artists intervene into these technological spaces? And what are the things that we think of, and what are the ways that technology reflects humanity? And why do we choose as artists to work with technology? Those are very important framings of the work that I do. So I guess within that, I did my work in classical percussion. I got working into sound a lot. Sound is sort of my primary medium, if you want to call it that. And I do think that sound is uniquely connected to emotion. There's no other medium that really conveys emotion the way that sound does. And I think in terms of how sound and how the sensorium of sound is an evolution of tactile and touch. So, I think we evolved as, touching things in probably some sort of motion, and then these hairs evolved in our ears. that then detected vibrations, and that grew into a separate sort of sensorial space within our brains. And that's really important. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear me. Let me just move this microphone closer. Does that help a little bit? Yeah. Okay, sorry. Let me move this thing. One more. Okay. So, I think a lot about sound. Speaking of which, though. And so, to really frame this out, I guess there are three primary ways that I have to approach my work, and that's the technical, conceptual, and historical. I will say that, for my part, a lot of time, I can be somewhat critical of artists that put their work in a vacuum and say, this is all the research I've been doing, this is the work they're doing. And I don't think that's ever really the case. I do think, we have an art history, and we have this sort of like building blocks of all this stuff that we've worked on as artists. And I think, we have the same type of foundations technically, right? Of all these computer scientists, all these technologists, all of these designers, engineers that are constantly building to make new tools available for us to work with and use. And so I do question how artists and technologists and scientists all position themselves historically within this context, right? So that's one thing. The conceptual, the big thing for me is like, why are we doing this? Is this some sort of technological masturbation that we're trying to make sort of the next toy? That seems somewhat interesting, I guess. But I'm really interested in this critical space, especially lately. So, I'll get into that some more, but I'm going to show, two primary works that are somewhat older, and it's an interesting place as an artist to be reflective and critical of your own work, which happens quite a bit as well. But I do think this conceptual space of what we're talking about within society is very important in my work. And then finally, the technical, like the how, is also fairly important, and that has its own sort of political devices that are embedded within that, right? So the tools that we use are inherently political, and the tools that we use come with a sort of embedded weight of the reason for why we use the tools that we use specifically. Also, I hope this is fairly casual. Does anybody disagree with me so far? If you guys have any questions, feel free to ask. I'm super in the best face. So, I guess with that said, tonight I'm going to talk about two pieces and really run two demos, and just talk about these types of works that I'm interested in, and talking about sound as a medium and how sound as a medium really plays out. So, the first one I'll show is Modulator. As I said, I've got 4 applications now in the Apple App Store, and so this process of developing software, developing tools and libraries for software has been a big part of my practice. And then what does it mean to reappropriate sort of this this mass industry tool like the App Store for art distribution? That's a big question, right? And how do artists today, I think this question came up of how the art medium and the sort of commercial space of art has changed over the years. Well, how do we as artists survive in the Bay Area in 2019? Because that's also another major part of this equation. I will also talk about Waveguide, which is a work that also uses distributed computation. So that's built using Amazon Web Servers. And it's sort of like this, multiple head audio structure that spans the globe. So this first piece, Modulator, is an application I developed. I think I just wish to get this close one on. And again, back to that idea, when I was developing this, I initially developed it in 2014, and then had a major revision in 2017. So it's a bit of an older work at this point for me and like my bigger body of work. But I think it shows decently well, and it sort of can explain some of the ideas. So you can see the basis of this thing. It's like a pretty simple interface, and it's 16 synthesizers. So you'll see when I turn this on, it processes audio in real time. And I think, what if I can poke this down here? I don't know if that'll just No, it won't quite make it. But some of the ideas that I was interested in, again, were this idea of tactility of sound. So can we touch sound waves? And what does it mean to mix modes of human perception? So within this piece, what I found was that without touching the piece, I can touch the sound waves. So what's happening is that I'm using the microphone plus the speakers to bring sound into the device and then create a real-time audio feedback loop. And then I'm using my hands to act as a physical high-pass filter on that sound wave, right? It's touching the sound waves and then changing the way the sound is modulated in the air. This device also has 16 synthesizers, like I said. And so it was based off this idea of a matrix synthesizer. And I guess one of my, again, back to that idea of historical provenance of this work and technologically where we come from. I tend to, I think one of the big ideas is that computers are broken into three primary areas of history, right? We have mechanical computation, something like an abacus or something like this. Then we have analog computation, which is akin to these things, these big synthesizers, right? And those were all based on signal processing and the way a signal was modulated. Then we have digital computation. So when I was building this at Stein, the Studio for Electroacoustic Music in Amsterdam, and thinking a lot about, well, what were the constraints of this older technology? And how can the constraints of this older technology inform our current paradigm for computation, right? So looking back historically at the engineering precedents of this work and saying, well, like the guys who built this stuff, they weren't totally crazy. And they were solving a lot of really important issues. And a lot of this stuff has already been done. And thinking about the current paradigm of like cell phones, all of a sudden we're in a new paradigm where we're sort of limited by computational power and we're limited by electricity and power that are within these devices. So how can we turn that into sort of jazz and improvise freely within these platforms, right? That became a really important space for me in thinking. So again, like this stuff, I didn't build this all from scratch. I wasn't like, soldering transistors together. I built this with a number of libraries that were already existent. I started with a project out of Princeton, out of the school there called Novocaine. So Novocaine was this early iOS audio library that was quite effective at doing the thing that I wanted to do, which at the time nobody had really done, which was connect the microphone to the speakers, like that's all I wanted to do, and it was very, very tricky at first because Apple isn't super excited by using its technology that way, turns out. Anyway, so then I moved on to use this project libpd, and so Pure Data, for those of you that don't know, is sort of this open source audio programming library that is a fairly abstract level. So when we think about computer abstraction, we have levels that are deep, that you get a lot of access to the computer, and then you have levels that are high, and you don't have as much access, but they're easy, they're more human compatible, versus levels that are deeper, which are more machine compatible, right? And so if we think about these like layers of how we talk to computers, libpd happens to be a fairly high level audio programming language, but it worked for what I wanted to do, especially in building synthesizers, which is something that I love doing. So, anyway, this next piece, I think, I would like to talk about is called Waveguide, and I'm not going to do the tour de force that I think some of our other speakers would do. I'm only going to show two pieces tonight. But this second piece, Waveguide, again, I was positioning this stuff historically, so thinking in terms of like, well, where have we gone and what have we done with computers in these spaces? So, you know, I was really sort of resonant with Kit Galloway and Sherry Ragnitz, Hole in Space in 1981, which was one of the first, you know, networked telematic pieces. You know, where they had a satellite feed that was connecting New York to Los Angeles. Has anybody heard this piece in here? Yeah, it's a classic. It's such a good piece, and I think that piece was so important for the first time. You know, we could have live coast-to-coast communication that people could just go interact with. And there's something really magical about that. That, you know, if you're an artist and you're given access to a satellite, what you build. In that space, I think for art and technology in general is so important. Oftentimes, artists do not have access to these like huge engineering and sophisticated devices, right? So that's amazing. Other pieces that were pretty important, I think, thinking in terms of like Golan Levin and his work with dial tones, that's another important sort of piece for this idea of telematic art. Roy Ascott, also sort of one of these foundational figures in the medium of telematic art, thinking what it means to use networks to really build works out of, you know, like so every day, all of us are sort of immersed in this technology, right? We have the internet all around us. I think James Bridle just recently wrote in his book, The Dark Enlightenment, that, you know, we're sort of immersed in the internet. We went from a computational paradigm where, you know, humans had to walk into like potentially a room this size and work with one computer and patch in these, you know, sort of bays. And then those computers actually started to get smaller, but at the same time started to get bigger, right? And so now we're inside of this sort of global internet infrastructure where we're really surrounded by this global scale computer, right? And that becomes really interesting to think about, I think, conceptually for me and how I position my work. Some other groups like the Hub, I think, thinking about, you know, what does sound as a medium mean in this? So, let's see, would you all be willing to try and experiment with me? We'll find out if this works. I don't know if I could or could not. If you could go to this website for me, andrewblanton.com/node.html. I'm going to jump out of this real fast. Let me put this over here so you can still see that. The .html part is somewhat important, so don't forget that. I'm just going to bring up a browser and show you. Also, just as a fail-safe. So you'll have to make sure two things. If your iPhone is on, make sure that your ringer is turned on and then your volume is turned on. Okay, I'm hearing things. That's good. And if you get there, you should see a site that looks something like this. Let's see, how about my sound? Yeah. Yeah, that's true. So if you can get there, I want like as many people on this as possible so we can get a loud sound. That's important. I don't know why my sound isn't running very well out of this computer, but that's all right. So I'll show this. This is another interface into this thing. So as I turn this on, you'll notice the sound changes. And what this is creating essentially is, like I said, it's like a multi-head audio installation. So thinking in terms of each one of your guys' computers, or phones rather, acting as a speaker to this audio array, it creates this ambient wash of sound in the room. Now, this is all happening in real time. You can play it. And I guess I can prove it to you. Oh, somebody's really on. So if I do something like this, I can sort of play your phone in real time. from the stage, right? And so I think thinking about what it means to be immersed in this internet and what it means to have all these phones around us all the time, right? Okay, cool. All these phones that are like constantly around us. Well, can we as artists reappropriate those systems? No, yeah, you're just going now. Here we go. But the interesting thing about this for me is that this sound is coming from this really simple Max patch and then bouncing to an Amazon EC2 server in Oregon, and then coming back and playing through all of your phones. So in this way, we have this sort of global scale internet infrastructure that's supporting this work and creating this sound piece that stretches across the planet, right? And the first time this happened, I was in Amsterdam, and hitting this server in Oregon, and it came back within like a quarter of a second. And I think there's something that's really profound to me about that, and how we do have this data that's moving so quickly across the planet at this point. And that infrastructure, making that active and visible, is something that I think is really interesting.
Is this creating a feedback, or is it just simply one way?
The reason why this is called waveguide was I was really interested in a particular type of synthesis called banded waveguide synthesis, where you have two delay lines and you inject noise into those delay lines and they bounce back and forth. And so my idea was that I was going to send data to the server and then bounce back and forth and be able to sonify that data. But that didn't happen. But this is simply sending data from this patch to the server and then driving a synthesizer that's built into the browser. Now, with that said, I built a number of iterations of this particular piece before I got here, right? Because it's like trying to build in these spaces is always a, I don't know, it's like collaboration with computers, right? So there were versions that I had that went two ways. That you can send from your device to a main synthesizer on stage, but I didn't like it as much. There was something slightly it always came out a bit chaotic.
Okay, we're at the QA section. Any questions?
Yeah.
So, with this, the other one, the first one that you were showing us with the speakers, so of course a theremin comes to mind.
Yeah.
So what's the relation between the two technologies?
Well, so theremins are based on radio waves, where we're interacting with radio waves, and I should know this because but I think it's your hand is moving into the radio frequency, and then that is being manipulated somehow with a theremin. That disruption. If somebody in the audience, does anybody in the audience know the answer to that actually?
I think it's capacitive.
Capacitive. So what does that mean exactly?
I think it's it's kind of the same principle that like kind of passive touch sensing is on.
Yeah, except when you just get close to it, then you're affecting the circuitry.
Yeah, you become a pretty decent path to ground.
Yeah.
So the electric field is being sucked out through your body.
Right.
And there's two electrodes.
Right. So that's a totally different thing though than Modulator, which is a feedback loop that's happening between a speaker and a microphone. So typically when I perform with my Modulator, I perform with it like sort of frequently also, and there's a sound art piece that's associated with it that I read that's sort of referential to I'm sitting in a room, and I'll hold it up to a speaker. And when you hold it up to a speaker, it actually creates that bigger feedback loop in between the two systems. So yeah, it's a great question.
I think it was a question, how do you know if your phone is being a node on the system, so to speak? You don't really know. There's no way of knowing.
Well, what do you mean exactly? Because I guess, so...
How do you know it's interacting in this network?
Well, you should have audio feedback of hearing the actual like ringing, right? But
here. From your phone?
Yeah. Yeah, if you're, yeah. But there's, you should see, if you don't see anything on the screen also, you'll know that you're not connected.
I do see something on the screen.
Oh, interesting. So it means your ringer might be off. Is your volume up?
Put my volume all the way up.
Who knows? Sorry, yeah. But it's like, so there are a number of feedback mechanisms where you'll get sound, but you'll also, like from the server side, there's also, it'll show on the server as well. So, any questions? Yeah.
Can we access this at any time, or do we have to be in proximity?
No, you can always access it. And so, yeah, it's just,
Also want to touch making images.
what's it, how's it making images?
It does, like when you do that on the,
Yeah.
it makes it
Yeah, exactly. And it'll drive the synthesizer as well when you touch it. And that's some like pretty modest interactivity. But they're you know, that data is all being sent back to the server as well. That could potentially be used to drive other synthesizers, which is what I was doing earlier. But I like the broadcast model of synthesis a bit more. You know, and like the thing is, like I'm a drummer, and I got really sick of hauling audio gear around. Like that is the worst. And I was like playing all these electroacoustic pieces, and it's such a drag to like go to all your drums to the gig, and then you get all these speakers, and then you're just like, oh, it's such a bummer. And so like what I decided was that, oh, like everybody's walking around with these $1,000 computers in their pocket. Maybe I could reappropriate those in some meaningful way. And so that sort of feels like, how do we work with this technology that's all around us, you know? Instead of being gratuitous about having it.